Okay, so we're back. So hopefully you just did numbers 1 through 9 on the Unit 11 worksheet number 1. And now what we're going to do in this part of the notes is we're going to figure out and we're going to learn the entire process of how to do a mathematical concept called completing the square. Okay, so let's say that I give you this example right here. Y is equal to x to the second power plus 8x plus 11. Okay, and I say, here's what I want you guys to do. I want you to do a concept called completing the square. Okay, so what we're going to do is, here's how we do it. All right, here's what you do. You leave the y alone. And then what you're going to do is you're going to make a parentheses. You're going to start a parentheses, and you're going to make a parentheses about as long, about as big, give enough space about as the entire problem is. Okay, but the very last term, which we call the C term, I want you to write that term outside the parentheses. And then on the inside of the parentheses, I want you to write the x squared part, and then I want you to write the plus 8x part. Okay, so whenever you're doing a concept called completing the square, this is going to always be your first step. Put a parentheses, write the x squared part and the bx part in your parentheses, leave a space, and then take the c part and put it outside the parentheses. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make a perfect square trinomial inside this parentheses. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we just learned how to do it. We're going to take this b term right here, which is 8. We're going to divide it by 2. That's 4. And then we're going to raise that to the second power, and that's equal to 16. Okay, so then I'm going to put a plus 16 right here. Okay, now that trinomial is called a perfect square trinomial. How do I know it's a perfect square trinomial? Well, because that number 16 was derived by taking that number 8, dividing it by 2, and squaring it. That's how we make a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so now what I have to do is I am going to have to now, because I wrote plus 16 inside the parentheses, whatever you write inside the parentheses, outside the parentheses you have to write the opposite of whatever you wrote inside the parentheses. So I write a minus 16 outside the parentheses. And technically, what these 16s would do is they would cancel each other out. And if they canceled it out, just picture it, are you back to where you started your problem at? Absolutely. So in a weird sort of way, this problem right here is the exact same problem as what we started with. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm now going to factor. So I'm going to take what's inside the parentheses here, and I'm going to factor that trinomial. Okay, so what is that how do we factor a trinomial? Well, remember, a trinomial always factors into two binomials. And since this trinomial is a plus plus, this means my factors are going to be x plus and x plus. And then I have to find the two distinct numbers that'll be the factors for this trinomial. Well, how do I do that? Once again, remember, I take the last number of my trinomial, which is 16, and I make a list of all the distinct pairs of numbers that multiply to make 16. 1 times 16, 2 times 8, 4 times 4. One of those pairs are going to be my distinct factors. Which one is it? Well, it's going to be 4 and 4. Why 4 and 4? Because I look right here at my middle term, my b term, that's positive 8. 4 plus 4 is 8. So this factors into x plus 4 and x plus 4. Okay, now what would I write outside the parentheses? What's positive 11 minus 16? That's minus 5. Okay, so notice what I've done so far. I started with the problem. I made a perfect square trinomial. That's why it says make a perfect square trinomial. Then I factored the perfect square trinomial. So the second thing that we do when we complete the square is you factor the perfect square trinomial. Get it? P, S, T. Okay, and then if you notice what we have here is we have how many x plus 4s? Well, we have 2x plus 4s. So what I could do is I could write that as 1 parentheses. So I'm going to have x plus 4, and I have 2 of them. So I could rewrite x plus 4 and x plus 4 as x plus 4 in parentheses to the second power minus 5. Okay? So the third thing that I do is I'm going to write using one set of parentheses. Okay, and it's always going to be parentheses squared. Okay, so you guys notice I started with this problem right here. All right, I did a process called completing the square, and I ended with that form of a quadratic equation right here. All right, so you guys, so now let's think. Well, what type of form is this equation that I started with in? Well, that's in standard form. Okay, so I started with the equation in standard form, and then I ended with this type of form right here. What type of form is that? If you forgot, that is called vertex form. Okay, so really what we're doing is we're learning how to take an equation in standard form and how to change it into an equation in vertex form. Okay, now what does that tell me? Well, since this equation is in vertex form, if you recall, you should now be able to tell me the exact coordinates of where the vertex of either one of these equations are. Okay, how do I get it? Well, remember the x value in vertex form, the x value of your vertex is always the opposite the number that's inside the parentheses. So inside the parentheses I have a plus 4 in vertex form. That means my x value's vertex is negative 4. And then the y coordinates of my y value for the coordinates of my vertex when my equation's in vertex form is always the number outside the parentheses to the right. I see a minus 5 here, so that means my vertex is at negative 4, negative 5. Okay, so this is what we're learning how to do today. How to take an equation in standard form, how to do a process called completing the square, and then we're going to end up with an equation in vertex form, and then how to tell what the vertex is. Okay, let's go ahead and do another example so you get the idea of this. Once again, if you're not sure what I'm doing, pause the video, re-watch it, and then hopefully it'll start making sense. So how about y is equal to x to the second power plus 4x plus 14. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to change this equation, which is in standard form, and I want to change it into vertex form, and I'm going to use a process called completing the square. So the first thing I do is I make a perfect square trinomial. So remember, here's what we do. We leave the y alone, we leave the equal sign alone, we write a parentheses, leave a lot of space. You take the last term, plus 14, you put it outside the parentheses. You take the x squared and the plus 4x and you put it inside the parentheses. Now, inside the parentheses, we're going to fill in right here to make this a perfect square trinomial. So how do I do that? Well, I take my middle term, which is 4. I divide it by 2, that gives me 2, and then I square it. 2 squared is 4, so I put a plus 4 here. Why did I put a plus 4, not a minus 4? Well, that 4 is positive, okay? Now, if I put a plus 4 inside the parentheses, what do we have to put on the outside of the parentheses to balance it out? We put the opposite, we put a minus 4. Okay, so you guys, when I'm completing the square, I make a perfect square trinomial. Now I'm going to factor the perfect square trinomial. Okay, so I'm going to take the y, I'm going to leave it, then I'm going to factor this trinomial. So this trinomial, remember trinomials factor into two binomials. Because it's a plus plus trinomial, my factors are going to be x plus and x plus, and now I'm going to find the distinct numbers that go in my factors. So I look at the very last number here inside my parentheses, that's what I'm factoring, which is positive 4, and I write down the specific pairs of numbers that multiply to make 4, 1 times 4 and 2 times 2. Whoops, let me move it up here so you can see it. Okay, 1 times 4 and 2 times 2. One of those is my factors. Which one is it? Well, it's 2 times 2. Why? Because I have a 4 right here. 2 plus 2. So my factors are x plus 2 and x plus 2, and then outside my parentheses, what's positive 14 minus 4? Well, that's positive 10, so I write a plus 10. Okay, so am I done? Well, let's look. Completing the square. Make a perfect square trinomial. I did that. Factor the perfect square trinomial. I did that. The last thing I do is I write using one set of parentheses. It's going to be one set of parentheses to the second power. Okay? So I'm going to rewrite this problem using, notice I have how many x plus 2's in parentheses do I have? I have 2 of them. So I'm going to rewrite it as one set of parentheses. One set of x plus 2's, but I have 2 of them, so that's going to be to the second power, and then I have plus 10. Okay? So once again, so what did I do? And I'm done. So what did I do here? I started with this form. That's, once again, that's in standard form, and then I changed it into vertex form. This is the process called completing the square. So this equation is in vertex form. Okay? Now, why do we put things in vertex form? Well, the answer is because now I know exactly where the vertex is. So I look inside the parentheses, I see a plus 2. That means my vertex's x value is the opposite of that, negative 2. I look outside the parentheses, I see a plus 10. That means my vertex's y value is exactly the same. So my vertex for this equation would be the point negative 2, positive 10. All right, so let's do one more of completing the square so that we get the idea of how to do this. Okay, number 3. So let's take one more example and let's work on how to change from standard form into vertex form. And let's go ahead and use one that has subtraction symbols in it so we get the idea. So x squared minus 14x. Whoops, I forgot something here. So let's restart. Sorry. Number 3, I forgot the y equals. No big deal. X squared minus 14x, and then let's go ahead and go minus 8. Okay, so I want to change this equation into vertex form, and I'm going to use the process called completing the square. So what do? Remember, the first thing I do, leave the y, leave the equal sign, draw a set of parentheses, make it pretty long, write the x squared inside the parentheses, write the minus 14x inside the parentheses, do not write the minus 8 inside the parentheses, move the minus 8 to the outside of the parentheses. Now I'm going to fill in this part, I'm going to make this a perfect square trinomial. So how do I do that? Well, I take my b term, my middle term, which is negative 14, I'm going to divide it by 2. That gives me negative 7, and then I'm going to raise that number to the second power. And once again, if you're doing it on a calculator, put the negative 7 in parentheses. So that is positive 49. So I put a plus 49 inside the parentheses. I now have a perfect square trinomial. Now I have to balance it out outside. I wrote plus 49, so outside I write minus 49. That balances those two out. Okay? So now I'm now going to take this trinomial right here, which is called a perfect square trinomial, and I'm going to factor it. So this is going to factor into y equals, and I'm going to get 2 parentheses. Okay? This trinomial is a minus and a plus. That means what will my factors be? My factors will be x minus and x minus. Now to find the distinct numbers that go into my factors, I take my last number of my trinomial, which is 49, and I make a list of all the specific pairs of numbers that multiply to make 49. There's only 2, 1 times 49 and 7 times 7. Which one of those pairs can I add or subtract together to make negative 14? Well, it's 7 and 7. And they're both minus, so I know it's going to be x minus 7 and x minus 7. And then outside both parentheses, what is minus 8 minus 49? That would be minus 57 or negative 57, depending on how you look at it. Okay, am I done yet? No. What do I have to do? I'm just going to combine both of these x minus 7's into one parentheses. So I'm going to have one parentheses. It's going to be to the second power because I have 2 of the exact same thing. I have 2 x minus 7's. Okay, and then I put a minus 57 here. All right, so I am done. Notice, once again, I started with this equation here, y equals x squared minus 14x minus 8. That's called standard form, and then I changed it into what is called vertex form of the quadratic equation. All right, so why do I do that? Why do I put something in vertex form? Well, the answer is, so now we know exactly what are the coordinates of the vertex. So what's the x coordinate of the vertex? I look inside the parentheses. I see a minus 7, so the x coordinate's the opposite of that, positive 7. What's the y coordinate of the vertex? It's the number outside the parentheses, and it's exactly the number that you see. So that means the vertex of this equation would be found at the point 7, negative 57. Okay? All right, so that's your notes for completing the square. So now what I want you guys to do is, I want you to do, you're on Unit 11. Okay, we are on Worksheet 1. And these are the problems that I want you to do on Worksheet 1. You're going to be doing this process. You're going to be doing the process of completing the square to change an equation into vertex form. So I want you to do numbers 10 through, let's see, let's have you go 10 through 15. Okay, and then let's go ahead and have you do number 18 and number 20. Okay, so work on those. If you have questions, ask as you're working, but work on them. See you next time.